Other than that, going home was my other options throughout my time in undergrad, but that was mainly because I didn't have a major interest in going anywhere specific and spending the money at the time.
Yeah, no. Well, that makes sense, and that kind of gives a good starting point for some of the background of why we looked into this study. But I think really what got started for us was in class. Dave was talking about a possible topic with this, and then how it was close to spring break, so kind of seeing what people would be doing, kind of what that looked like. So with that, we just really wanted to focus on undergraduate students because even though I went on a spring break and I know you did, Maisie, not everyone does while you are in graduate school. But yeah, so we just started talking to students basically. So we were able to get 200 participants to take a survey, which was short, sweet, to the point. And from that, we had initially 30 people who were interested in doing interviews. And we kind of a little bit less tapered off that actually did end up doing that. So Maisie, do you want to talk a little bit about what you found with interviewing some of the students?
Yeah, so Molly and I both conducted interviews, just our schedules worked and aligned with that. A lot of students didn't go on spring break. A lot of them went home for the most part. But I think they wish they would have gone, but not in a traditional sense. So I asked general questions like, have you been on spring break? Like, what would your spring break look like? Have you done a university-sponsored spring break? And a lot of times they didn't know anything about any of the university-sponsored spring breaks. But then I kind of explained to them, like, what the university has to offer right now. And I don't think any of them, like, really felt like that was something that they wanted to do. Like they didn't feel super outdoorsy. One of them talked about wanting to do a study abroad opportunity, but because it's thousands of dollars, they weren't able to do that. So I started explaining at the end of my interview kind of what my ideas would be for this. In the end, we'll kind of touch on that later. But they seem to be very excited about culturally enriching spring break trips.
I think that kind of like with our spring break that we just talked about, maybe sharing our stories with these students maybe could even like inspire them to go on breaks as well, because I think that a lot of times what we were finding in this research was, just the typical view of spring break, like going with all my friends on a cruise or they're going down to Cancun or something like that, makes a spring break pretty unattainable in a lot of students' minds. But, Maisie, as you talked about, like, yours were pretty cheap both times, and you still had a lot of fun. So I think that, we can start to, backtrack on that stigma of that a spring break has to be this big, fancy trip that you have to spend thousands of dollars on. When in reality, I think, 63% of our students that we surveyed spent less than $100 on their spring break.
Yeah.
So maybe sharing that with other students would lessen that stigma.
No, absolutely. And especially if we showed them some of the data that, of the nearly 200 people we talked to, only 7 spent more than $1,000. And I would assume that if we looked at that, it would more often than not be they would have answered in addition that they had help or that it was their family that did fund that trip. When there is so many people that just it is much more attainable to spend, $100, $200 for that project. So, Maisie, when you were doing your interviews, what did it seem that students would feel comfortable spending?
Yeah, so I talked to them and asked what would be the amount that you would spend, and a lot of them felt that it was between like $250, $300 they'd be willing to spend if we could make this a very enriching experience for them.
Oh, yeah, and that makes sense because, $200, $250, that sounds a lot more feasible than, $1,000, $700, $800, especially when, through the interviews, if you want to touch on what the students were saying, when students would ask them, what are you doing for spring break? What do you do for fun? Anything like that. I know you had mentioned that they really didn't know what to say.
Yeah, a lot of them didn't know what to say. They thought, I just have to go home. I don't have another choice. I wish I could do things, but I can't. But at the end of my interview with them, I started explaining the theory, like Bordeaux's theory of social reproduction, and going from there and talking to them about the idea of moving up in social classes and how they felt that their social class affected their future, and having that social capital, economic capital, or cultural capital. A lot of I thought it was funny. We went through and I asked, like, what does cultural capital mean to you? And they're like, I don't know, because so I kind of went in there and I was like, cultural capital is you gaining experiences from different cultures, and even like within the United States. So we started talking about, like, okay, like what if we did like a trip to like DC and you got to see museums
Smithsonian,
and things like that, or what if we did a trip to Chicago and there's so many free museums there, and they were just talking like, oh my goodness, like I've never got to go to a place like that. Or a lot of students were like, I've never been like out of Ohio. And I was like, that kind of hit. I was like, wow, like these students, like I feel, even though these are small drivable distances, that it could make a huge impact on their life, and being able to have those experiences and be able to talk about those in the future, I think this will help them build their social capital, cultural capital, to be able to move up in social classes in the future. Because a lot of the students that we interviewed with were first generation students, and that like we didn't directly ask that, but they came out in conversations.
Yeah, and trips like this that you're mentioning, where they could go to Chicago, DC, something close, is something that I think that the university could easily offer. I know we were discussing a little bit during our project presentation about, some grants or some scholarships that can definitely be looked into. So I don't think that it's necessarily anything that would be out of reach for any student. And they can always apply for a scholarship or something like that, even if, the university says, they're able to get the per person price down to something like 100 or 200, and then maybe even allow for scholarships after that for students to apply for. So I think these solutions that we're bringing up are something that is attainable for the university to offer.
I think especially because of that, there is a lack of it right now. We have global opportunities and study abroad, but again, there's usually a barrier for entry in terms of cost there. Susan can speak to the point from rec services that individuals, maybe they don't want to do outdoorsy things. That isn't always appeal to everyone. And with the Office of Community Engagement, they're doing service, but that's usually localized to the Athens area, or, camping, but still doing service in, an hour or two away. So definitely that is lacking, that cultural piece. And even if you could do it, 10, 15 students, that's 10 or 15 students more you're reaching that you aren't previously.
Right.
And then with your point, Maisie, about social capital, that people feel they need to keep up with others based on what they see on social media, and that, skewed perception that so many people are going down to Florida, so many people are going to, a student I know went to Italy, so going to Italy. These are not the majority. These are small groups of individuals, whereas other people can take part in those experiences.
Yeah, and I think it's definitely important to realize that these trips don't have to be a week long.
Yeah.
Like, because they're driving distance, we can drive there, go, stay 3 nights, 2 nights, whatever it ends up being, and make this an opportunity for students to be able to, like, a crash course into whatever city they're going to, and then kind of going from there. But
I think the main issue that we're finding here is that students don't have the opportunity to really take a break during their spring, or they don't know of the different opportunities that they could possibly have. And that's causing for students to not be aware of where they land in social class. Like, one of the main questions that we were getting when we were surveying students was, do I identify myself as what my parents are, or like me? And that was something that I think that students are obviously confused about. They don't know where they're at. So this is something that is evidently an issue on this campus, and of course it probably is in most other campuses as well.
Absolutely.
So, providing these options where, Matt, as you said, the university really doesn't provide all that many options for students right now, and I think it's something that the university can easily fix, where they're only offering these, these service trips, or as you said, like with Outdoor Pursuits, where it's a kayaking trip, and the trip is like $500 without equipment and everything, so that's not really feasible. Plus, it only markets to a very small population. Not most students are going to want to go on a week-long kayaking trip.
Yeah, and I
So-
think it also leaves out major groups that may have not be able to do that physical activity.
Yeah. I think that, especially with our results of only 3% even engaging in that university-sponsored spring break, really shows that for our implication to practice, what we're looking to do is promote and plan those. Find the office on campus that can promote and have the ability to offer those to our students,
Right.
and understand their background and their cultural capital that we're trying to give them during their experience at Ohio University or whatever institution we end up going to. But we focused here at OU, Ohio University. So
Yeah, this is something that student affairs professionals definitely want to start thinking about. You know, it's not necessarily an issue that you think of first when you think about all the different issues that you need to tackle on a college campus, you know, but it is something that's obviously having an impact on our students. And, you know, spring break a lot of times is really huge for us to get through the rest of spring semester, to really power through, because it's a long year. So I think that for student development and providing the experience that we want to provide in a higher ed environment, then it's something that, you know, we're definitely going to want to look into as student affairs professionals.
Yeah, absolutely. What do you all thought? What did you find to be the most shocking thing you learned in our research, or most surprising?
I think. Oh, please go.
I thought it was interesting because when we started this, we thought that students didn't do it because they couldn't afford them. And one of the quotes that we pulled from it is, I don't have the funds to go on a spring break. I work 2 jobs in order to fund my schooling.
Mm-hmm.
So reaching out to those students that have that experience, and we found that during our research, we found that students are having that experience that they feel like they can't afford and can't go on a spring break and can't learn that or can't have that cultural capital or do something for spring break, because it's like we talked about how over $1,000 for a spring break is our outlier in the whole research that we've done anyways, but letting them know that most people spend under $500 on spring break, which is more than half of our student population that we surveyed. So I thought that was really interesting that we did find the problem and we were able to reach out to those individuals too.
Yeah. Maisie, it sounded like you were going to say something.
Yeah, so I think for me that the idea that from our research we gathered that only 31% of students describe their spring break like as a trip or they went on a trip. I think that was huge for me because I have been a student here for 5 years now, and when I think of spring break, I think of everyone at Fort Lauderdale, like everyone goes to a beach, and I didn't realize the amount of students that went home, which from our research what ended up being 52% of students went home for spring break, and I think that was just such a large number, and I think it really changes the way that I will talk about spring break to my students in hall and talking to them about like what they're doing or like giving them ideas to help have those like cultural experiences if they can't go on a trip.
Yeah. Susan, how about you?
I think the most surprising thing for me wasn't one of the results that we had, but it was during our survey process. It was how many students, when we explained that we were doing a research survey on spring break, how many students said, "Oh, I just went home, like you don't want to hear about it." That, just thinking about how students feel as though their experiences don't mean anything just because they don't meet that stigma
Yeah,
that we
that
were
criteria,
talking about before, that social norm, which we could say isn't really a norm, obviously,
Yeah,
based on
what we
our
saw.
results. Yeah.
I think for me was the 3% that students that are accessed and engaging student driven alternative breaks at the university, just based on the experiences I've had at the institution I attended and the one I worked at for 2 summers. Alternative breaks in that office are huge. It's a huge thing, and they would have people go to Washington State to go and work and do service. They went to Pike's Place Fish Market or things like that, or they would go to New Orleans, and the trip was only about $250, and they had internal fundraising to facilitate that trip, where they did a Yankee Candle fundraiser. So really, at the end of the cost, it was only about $100 or something like that per person. So coming here to a place like Ohio University, I thought that would be huge. I thought it would be like having people do that kind of stuff all the time. So that definitely was a shock to me. So I think through all that, just if we want to wrap up and say a couple final implications for future practice, I think would be the best case.
Yeah, maybe what we think we can personally bring to our students.
Yeah, that's great.
I think that we can overall bring the knowledge to our students now that we know this, especially like Maisie talking about working in housing, for example, and talking to those students when they are talking about spring break, letting them know about opportunities and linking with resources that Ohio University can provide for students, making those connections and collaborations on campus, and giving students experiences that come up to us and say, you don't want to hear about my spring break, I'm not doing anything, things of that nature.
Mm-hmm.
I think making those connections and collaboration with other offices is really important.
Yeah, and I think for me, to promote the spring break experiences, the university run spring breaks, I feel like we don't hear about them and many students don't know about them. So I really want to get out there and maybe help with the marketing for that.
Yeah, I think my biggest takeaway here is just finding ways to apply these results to my students to help them continue to develop. So, for example, we realized how many students really didn't know much about social capital or cultural capital, and they really didn't know where they stand financially in society. So it's something that I think I might want to work with my students to educate them about social capital and cultural capital so that they can properly provide their own opportunities for themselves as they move forward.
I think one takeaway for the students that I work with is statistically more often they do have more money within their families and themselves. So they are more often to go on these trips, and that's across many institutions. So kind of talking to them about what that looks like and the experience of going to Italy, that may not be and is not something that often happens with a lot of students. So really that grounding experience and maybe allowing them to realize that they are very fortunate to have those experiences. But I think one of the biggest things that we can do as student affairs professionals is maybe just talk to people that are in higher administrative roles, be like, we think this is valuable. A lot of students find spring break to be, that quintessential college experience. And I'm not saying that that student has to have that every year of all your 4 years or however long you're here, but I think once is reasonable for them to be able to have that experience. So I definitely say that's something that maybe we can allocate that funds, find a way, student senate, when there's will, there's a way. And I think there definitely is a will from a lot of our students. So just want to thank our listeners and our sponsors for those of us who have been helping us out with this research.